Okay, this is a quick demo to show you how to take a shared storage cluster and add a third node in a different data center using SIOS DataKeeper. So let's start with a failover cluster manager. You can see we have a two-node cluster pre-configured, primary and backup. I have a resource group here with a couple resources, SQL Server resource, which is dependent on this shared disk resource called cluster disk 1. Essentially, what we have to do is replace this cluster disk 1 with a DataKeeper volume resource. Now, the DataKeeper volume resource is going to control the disk locking between the two local nodes, primary and backup, but it's also going to control the replication out to the third node called DR in the other data center. So to minimize the downtime associated with this, I've written a PowerShell script that's going to essentially swap out the cluster disk 1 with the DataKeeper volume resource, as well as create the replication job out to that DR node. So here's the PowerShell. We'll walk through it. First, we're going to stop the resource group. Then we're going to delete the cluster disk 1. Then we're going to bring that volume online, make sure it's readable. Then we're going to make sure that it's set to the proper drive letter. And then we're going to create the DataKeeper mirror, then create the DataKeeper job. Then we're going to add the cluster resource called DataKeeper volume X. Then we're going to set the property of that resource so that it uses the X drive job that we created earlier. And then finally, we're going to add the dependency back so that the SQL Server resource is dependent on the DataKeeper volume X. And then finally, we're going to start the cluster group SQL Server. So let's go ahead and run this process and let's see what happens. So this is just a warning because the X drive did come up properly. That's fine. Everything else is looking good and done. So the whole thing completed very quickly. You see now we have the SQL Server group. Instead of the cluster disk 1, we have a DataKeeper volume X, and SQL Server is going to be dependent on that volume. And if we look at DataKeeper, now we have this X drive is being replicated from primary to DR. And so there's only one other thing we need to do to complete this process, and that is to tell this DataKeeper job about the other local server called backup. And so we do that through managing the shared volumes. So we do this, and then we're going to add the backup as a shared volume. But at the moment, DataKeeper does not see that shared volume. So what we need to do is go out to the backup server and bring that volume online. And so we're going to do that now. So we're going to open disk management on that backup server. And we're going to initialize that volume. And that was the ephemeral drive we were initializing. Here's the volume that's offline. We're going to bring it online. Now we've done that, we're going to go back to the primary server, and DataKeeper will see this. It's going to take a little bit of time to refresh, but we should see in the server overview report on the secondary server. At some point, we'll see the X drive show up. What it does, then we know we can add this. We can use the edit to. We can manage the shared volumes. It's not there yet, so I'll give it a little bit of time. And sometimes to speed things up, you can take that X drive offline and back online, and the secondary server will see it quicker. or sorry, the backup server will see it quicker. Here we go. Oh, but I'm connected to backup. That could have been the problem. Connect to backup. There it is. So the X drive is online. So that was my problem. Okay, so now we're connected to the backup server. We should be able to go in here and manage the shared volumes. Here we are. Backup server. IP looks good. Click next. This target doesn't have any shared disk, so it's only a single server. So that's fine. Click done. And so what that's doing is updating this job so that it knows now if I bring the backup server online, it will be able to replicate from backup to DR. So right now it's replicating from primary to DR. But what if I go over here and failover cluster manager and I want to move this workload to the backup node? So again, that's the node in the local data center that shares the disk with the primary. So now we're online on backup. And in a moment, DataKeeper will update the job. So we see now the source is backup. It's replicating to DR. And all that happened automatically. Okay, so the next step really is depending upon what your plans are with that DR node. So if you were going to install SQL Server and add a third node to your cluster on the DR node, of course you would run your SQL Server setup and say add node to existing cluster and walk through that process. Then you would have a 3-node cluster. Now, if you're running SQL Server Standard Edition, Microsoft limits you to 2 nodes in the cluster, so you can't add that third node in failover clustering. Instead, DataKeeper has documentation on how to use that data on a third node. If you ever have a disaster, you can activate the third node as the source of the mirror and then attach those databases to a different standalone instance of SQL Server and repoint your applications in your DR site. So it really all depends on how you want to use that node. But at this point, the replication is going on to the third node, and you have successfully converted your 2-node shared storage cluster and added a third node in a different data center.